Let's get started. Story number 1.
It was supposed to be a typical night shift at the office. I'd been working as a late-night administrative assistant for about 6 months at a small but growing company in a fairly old building in the downtown area. The office was usually quiet, with only a few employees working into the night. The building itself was rather unremarkable, modern on the outside, but with an old, dated interior. The floors were creaky, the windows were foggy, and the lights flickered now and then, but I never thought much of it. It wasn't anything to make me believe in ghosts or anything like that. I'd had a few late nights before, working on reports or catching up on emails, but that night felt different from the start. I didn't know why at the time, but the air in the office seemed a little too still, the silence a little too thick. The usual hum of the fluorescent lights overhead felt somehow oppressive. The clock on my desk blinked 2:30 a.m. when the first odd thing happened. I was sitting at my desk, going through a pile of paperwork, when I heard a loud bang. It came from the storage closet across the room, and it startled me so much that I nearly knocked my coffee over. The sound echoed in the empty office, but there was no one else around. I stood up and walked to the closet, my steps slow and cautious. I knew that I should have checked the security footage, but I was too curious to wait. When I opened the closet door, nothing seemed out of place. The shelves were lined with boxes of old files, office supplies, and cleaning materials. The sound had definitely come from here, though. My heart was still racing, but I couldn't find anything that would explain the noise. I closed the door, shrugging it off. I went back to my desk, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Something about the silence felt too heavy. The fluorescent lights above buzzed intermittently, casting long shadows across the floor, and I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching me. But there was no one else in the office, just me, alone, working the night shift. I tried to focus on my work, but the air seemed to grow thicker as the night wore on. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:15 a.m. That's when I heard it again, this time from behind me. A whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The sound of a voice, low and barely audible, seemed to come from the far corner of the office, near the break room. I froze. My eyes darted toward the corner, but I couldn't see anything. No one else was there. I told myself it was just my imagination. The office was old, and the pipes and wires in the walls could create all sorts of odd noises. But deep down, I knew that it wasn't just my imagination. I had worked enough late nights to know the difference between the sounds of the building settling and something else. Something was off. I sat still for a moment, staring into the dimly lit corner of the office. Then I heard it again, a whisper, faint but distinct. Leave. I stood up abruptly, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't sure what to do. There was no one there. I knew that. Yet the words felt real, like they had come from the air itself. I turned my head toward the hallway outside the office, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway was empty. I grabbed my phone, thinking I'd call someone, anyone, but my hands were shaking too much to dial. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I felt like the walls themselves were closing in, like something was waiting just beyond my vision. The building creaked, and I jumped, my nerves fraying with every little noise. I couldn't explain it, but I felt utterly alone, and not in the usual quiet night shift way. I felt like there was something in the building with me, something that didn't belong. I decided to leave. I'd had enough. I grabbed my bag and walked quickly toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, I heard it again, this time a loud, metallic scraping sound. I turned to see the supply closet door open slightly, the edge of it scraping against the floor. It wasn't open when I'd checked earlier. It had been closed tight. I swallowed hard and walked toward the closet, my pulse quickening. There was no way the door had opened on its own. But when I reached it, the door slammed shut with a force that made me flinch. I was shaking now. The words from earlier, leave, echoed in my mind, and I could no longer ignore the fact that something was wrong. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next, but my body instinctively turned toward the exit again. The door seemed like the only way out, but as I stepped toward it, I felt the air shift behind me. Something brushed past me, something cold and unexplainable. I turned around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. The office was empty. I pushed the door open, feeling desperate to get out, but the hallway was unnaturally quiet. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I hurried down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the otherwise still building. As I reached the staircase, I heard it again, the scraping sound. This time it was louder, closer. It was coming from the stairwell behind me. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to know what it was. I just kept walking, faster now, my breath coming in shallow gasps. When I reached the main door to the building, I pulled on the handle, but it wouldn't open. It was locked. My hands were clammy, my mind racing. I turned, looking for another exit, but all I could see were the dark hallways stretching endlessly in front of me. The scraping sound grew louder. I could feel something moving behind me, just out of sight. I knew it was there, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I had to get out. I had to leave. I ran down the hallway to the back door and pushed on the handle with all my strength. To my relief, it opened. I stepped out into the night air, the cool breeze hitting my face, and I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the block. I never went back to that office again. Later, I found out that the building had a history. A former employee, a night janitor, had passed away years ago in that very office, alone on the night shift. His death had been sudden and unexplained, and no one had ever really understood what happened. I didn't need to know more. The whispers, the scraping, the feeling of being watched, it was all too real. Something had been waiting for me in that building, something that I would never forget. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
It was my third week working the night shift alone at the law office. I had just graduated college and was eager to get my foot in the door, even if it meant working the graveyard shift, in a place that felt eerily quiet after hours. The office was located in an old building downtown. Its high ceilings, long hallways, and large windows overlooking the city gave it a grand but slightly intimidating atmosphere. I'd been assured that the building had been renovated several times, so the creaky floors and drafty air were just part of the building's charm. The shift was simple: check the security system, ensure all the files were locked up, and answer any late-night phone calls from clients. By 2 a.m., most of the lights were dimmed, and the office was completely empty. I didn't mind the solitude, though. There was something oddly peaceful about the quiet after a long day of bustling office work. Or so I thought. The building had a strange history, one I didn't pay much attention to at first. The receptionist, Sarah, had mentioned it once, something about an old lawyer who had passed away under mysterious circumstances in the building decades ago. But I dismissed it. Old office legends never bothered me, and I was too focused on my tasks to think twice about it. The first week went by without incident. It was a typical routine. I'd lock the doors, make my rounds through the halls, and occasionally grab a coffee from the break room. I'd heard the occasional odd sound, a door creaking or something moving, but I thought little of it. The building was old, after all. The faint hum of the air conditioning system kept me company through the quiet hours. On my third week, however, things began to feel different. It started innocently enough. I was sitting at the desk in the reception area, scanning through emails when I heard a faint rustling sound coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the building settling or perhaps a gust of wind rattling the windows. But then I heard it again, this time louder, a shuffling sound, followed by what sounded like a door opening and closing. I glanced at the clock, 1:45 a.m. There was no one else in the office. Everyone else had left hours ago. I tried to shake it off as nerves. Maybe it was just the pipes or the ventilation system making noises. But the sound persisted, coming from the farthest office at the end of the hallway, the one that belonged to Mr. Lancaster, the head of the firm. His office had been empty for years. He had retired and passed away long before I started working there. I never thought much about his office, though it was always kept locked after hours. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and I stood up, deciding to investigate. I walked down the long hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent office. As I reached Mr. Lancaster's office door, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure it had been locked when I did my rounds earlier. I hesitated for a moment, but then pushed the door open slowly. The office was dimly lit by the glow of the streetlights outside, casting long shadows across the floor. Everything appeared normal. The desk was clean, the chairs neatly arranged, and the shelves full of legal books. But something felt wrong. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the air felt heavier, as if the room was holding its breath. I stepped inside, scanning the room with my eyes. There was nothing unusual to see, except for a faint smell, something old and musty. It was the kind of smell you might expect in a room that hadn't been touched in years. I walked over to the desk and turned the lamp on, hoping the light would make me feel better, but it only seemed to highlight the unsettling atmosphere in the room. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and I spun around, my heart racing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I walked back to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like something was pushing back on the other side. Panic set in, and I pulled harder, but the door wouldn't give. Then, just as I was about to scream for help, the door suddenly opened on its own, and I stumbled backward, gasping for air. I stood there in shock for a moment, trying to gather myself. The hallway outside was still empty, just like it had been when I entered. I didn't know what had just happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to leave the office, but as I turned to walk back toward the reception area, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a whisper, barely audible, coming from the corner of the room. My heart stopped. I turned around quickly, my breath catching in my throat, but the office was empty. No one was there. "Get out." The words were so faint I could hardly hear them, but they were unmistakable. I wasn't imagining it. The voice came from within the office, and it sounded old. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran back to the reception desk, my mind racing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right in that office. Something or someone was trying to tell me something. The rest of the night was a blur. I kept my eyes glued to the security monitors, checking them every few minutes as if waiting for something to happen. The unease that had settled in my chest wouldn't leave. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind felt like it was part of something bigger, something that I couldn't explain. Around 4 a.m., I decided I couldn't stay in that office any longer. I finished my rounds early, checked the doors, and called it a night. As I was walking out of the building, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat, a figure standing by the window in Mr. Lancaster's office. The blinds were drawn, but I could make out the silhouette of a person, or at least I thought I could. I froze in place, my blood running cold. My first instinct was to call security, but as I walked closer, I realized that the figure wasn't moving. I couldn't see any details, just the shape of a person standing perfectly still. I reached the door and opened it, but when I looked inside the office, there was no one there. The lights were off, the blinds were still closed, and the room was empty. I left the building without looking back, my hands trembling. When I told Sarah about what had happened the next day, she wasn't surprised. She mentioned that the building had always had strange occurrences, noises, objects being moved, and sightings of figures in the windows. Apparently, Mr. Lancaster had been a tough and strict boss, and some people believed that his spirit still lingered in the office. It seemed that the stories were true. I never worked another night shift at that office again. The unease I felt in Mr. Lancaster's office, the whispering voice, and the figure in the window, it all became too much. I don't know what it was that tried to warn me, but I never wanted to find out. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I had been working the night shift alone at a small accounting firm for a few weeks when things started to get strange. I didn't think much of it at first. Night shifts can make anyone a little jumpy, right? The silence in the office was always thick, and the only sounds were the occasional hum of the fluorescent lights or the soft tap of my keyboard as I worked through spreadsheets. It was usually pretty peaceful, just me and the building. I had worked at this firm for about 6 months, and the office itself was in an old brick building that had been renovated a few times over the years. The walls were thin, and the floors creaked under my feet as I moved through the halls. There were only 3 other employees, but they always left well before the shift ended, so I spent the last few hours alone. The building had a strange energy to it. It wasn't the kind of place that felt warm and welcoming, but I didn't mind it. It was just work, after all. One night, around 11:30 p.m., I was sitting at my desk trying to finish up a report when I heard a noise from across the office. It wasn't the kind of sound that could be explained away. This was a sharp, distinct scraping, like metal dragging against the floor. I looked around the quiet room and my heart skipped a beat. I was sure that I had been the last one to leave the office earlier, and everyone else had gone home hours ago. The sound came from the small storage room at the end of the hall. I froze, listening for any other sounds. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate. My mind raced. There was no one else in the building. Or was there? Maybe someone had slipped in unnoticed? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door creaking. The storage room door had opened slightly. I stood up slowly from my desk, my legs shaking, and walked toward the hallway. Every step felt too loud in the silence. I turned the corner, but the hallway was empty. The storage room door was wide open now, and I could see a faint light flickering inside. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't left that light on. I hesitated, but then forced myself to move forward. As I stepped closer to the door, I could feel the air growing colder. It wasn't just a draft. It felt wrong. I pushed the door open with a slight creak. The light inside flickered again, casting strange shadows on the stacks of boxes and filing cabinets. Nothing seemed out of place. But the temperature, it was colder than it should have been. I stood there for a few moments, staring into the room, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow flitting across the far wall, moving too quickly for it to be a trick of the light. I turned to look, but the shadow was gone. My pulse quickened. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. The silence that followed was thick, almost oppressive. I closed the door and stepped back, my mind racing. I had to be imagining things. There was no way anyone else was in the building. I walked back to my desk, trying to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every now and then I would hear soft footsteps echoing down the hallway, though I knew no one was there. Sometimes I would see something move in my peripheral vision, just a flicker of motion, but when I turned my head, there was nothing there. I glanced at the clock, 1:30 a.m. By this point, I was on edge, but I told myself I was just tired. It had been a long shift. I decided to get up and stretch my legs, so I walked down the hallway to the break room. The building felt even colder now. I could see my breath in the air as I stepped through the hallway, and my footsteps seemed to echo louder than usual. The office lights buzzed faintly above me. I pushed open the door to the break room, but when I stepped inside, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The light was flickering there too, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't a simple flicker. It was as if something was interfering with the light, making it blink erratically. I stood there for a moment, staring at the light. That's when I noticed it. A figure, just a shadow in the dim light, standing in the far corner of the room. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was too still, too motionless. It wasn't until I blinked that it seemed to disappear, vanishing into the darkness. I quickly turned and ran back to my desk, my heart pounding in my chest. My hands were shaking as I sat back down in my chair, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat. I couldn't leave, not yet. I was too scared to leave. But I couldn't stay either. The building felt off. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. I glanced at the clock again. It was 3 a.m. now, and I had never been so anxious. I looked at the door, half expecting to see someone standing there, but no one came. That's when I heard the voice, a faint whisper, like someone was standing right next to me, but there was no one there. My blood ran cold. I turned quickly, my chair creaking, and I saw something that made my stomach drop, a figure standing just inside the doorframe of the office. It wasn't fully there, more of a translucent shadow, but I could make out the faint outline of a person. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to scream, to run out of the building, but my legs were frozen in place. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. Then it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't waste a second longer. I grabbed my things, ignoring the panic that was rising in my chest, and I bolted out the door. I ran down the stairs to the lobby and didn't stop until I was outside, gulping in the cool night air. My hands were trembling as I pulled out my phone and called Sarah, the receptionist who worked the day shift. "Sarah, something is wrong in this building," I said, my voice shaky. I don't know what it is, but there's something here. Something not right. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You know, I've heard the same things. The strange noises, the lights flickering, the shadows in the corners of the rooms. You're not the first one to feel it, and you're probably not the last. The building has a history, you know. It was built over an old cemetery, and they say the spirit of someone who never left haunts the office. Maybe that's what you're experiencing." I didn't stay long enough to ask for details. I didn't care to know. I never worked another night shift there after that. I transferred to a different location, and though I've worked many late nights since, I've never experienced anything quite like that again. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The office had been quiet for hours. I was just finishing up some paperwork when I glanced at the clock, 12:47 a.m. I had another 2 hours left on my shift. Most nights, I didn't mind the solitude. It was peaceful in a way. The office was an old downtown building, one of those places that seemed to have history lingering in the air. It creaked and groaned at odd hours, especially at night, and the faint hum of the overhead lights was always there. Some people found it unnerving, but to me, it felt like part of the charm. I had only been working the night shift for a few weeks. The firm I worked for was small, only a handful of employees, and the others left by 6 p.m., leaving me alone in the office to close up. I'd walk through the building, checking the windows, locking the doors, and making sure everything was in place. Sometimes I'd grab a cup of coffee, sit in the break room for a few minutes, and enjoy the silence. It was routine, and the job was fine. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to worry about. Or so I thought. It was a Thursday night, and the weather had taken a turn. The wind outside howled against the windows, and the sky had opened up, releasing a heavy rain that beat against the glass like 1,000 tiny fists. The office had the usual eerie stillness, but tonight, there was something else. It wasn't the storm. There was a shift in the air, a tension that I couldn't explain. I was sitting at my desk, scrolling through emails when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. My first instinct was to check the time. It was nearly 1 a.m. The other employees had long gone home. I stood up and walked into the hallway, peering around the corner. The sound had stopped, and the hallway was empty, just as I had expected. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind rattling the building, but as I turned back to my desk, I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, this time closer, as if someone was walking toward me. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen, listening. Then, to my surprise, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening. It was coming from the back of the office, from the room where the file cabinets were kept. The door didn't just creak open slowly, as you might expect. It was as if someone had pushed it open forcefully, deliberately. My pulse quickened. I wasn't sure what to do. I felt foolish, standing in the middle of the hallway, debating whether to check it out. My thoughts raced. Had someone gotten in without me noticing? But the security system was armed, and I'd checked all the locks. I was alone in the building. No one was supposed to be here. I stepped cautiously toward the back of the office, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The door to the storage room was now wide open. I had always kept it closed when I left each night. It was a small, dimly lit room filled with old files and boxes that we didn't need. As I stepped closer, I could feel the temperature drop, uncomfortably cold, as if a draft had swept through the room. I hesitated for a moment, then peered inside. The room was empty. There was nothing unusual about it. The boxes and files were neatly stacked against the walls, and nothing appeared out of place. I stepped inside, feeling the cold air on my skin, and looked around once more. The door to the room was ajar, and the faint flicker of the overhead light made the shadows dance across the walls. I was about to leave when something caught my eye. A piece of paper lying on the floor near the corner of the room. I bent down to pick it up, thinking maybe one of the boxes had shifted and dropped it. But when I unfolded the paper, my stomach lurched. It was an old photograph, one I hadn't seen before. It was black and white, slightly yellowed with age, and it depicted the office building just as it was now, but there was a figure standing in the window. The figure was indistinct, a blur of shadow, but I could make out the shape of a person. My heart started pounding. I didn't know why, but something about the photo unsettled me. Maybe it was the fact that the figure looked so out of place. I didn't know how to explain it, but it was almost as if they were watching me. Suddenly, I heard another noise, a soft click, like a door closing. I spun around, but the storage room door was still open and the hallway was empty. My pulse raced. I was getting paranoid, I knew it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I quickly left the room and shut the door behind me. I walked back to my desk, trying to focus on the work in front of me, but my mind kept wandering. I kept thinking about the photograph. Who had left it there? Why was it in the storage room? The more I thought about it, the more I realized something strange. I didn't recognize the person in the photo. But the office was old. Maybe it had been taken years ago, before the renovation. The minutes stretched into hours. I kept glancing at the clock, trying to distract myself. 2:30 a.m. Still, I was alone. But then, just as I was about to close my laptop and wrap up for the night, I heard the footsteps again. Only this time, they were louder. They were approaching fast, coming closer from down the hallway. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned toward the sound. My first instinct was to call security, but I couldn't explain why. I was alone. It had to be my mind playing tricks on me. The storm outside had probably been messing with my head, and the building creaked with every gust of wind. I wasn't expecting anyone else. I wasn't expecting anything. But then the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything. But there was nothing. Silence. And then, just as suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of a knock on the door. The office door. My entire body tensed, and I stood there, staring at the door. I didn't move. The knock came again, 3 sharp raps, as if someone was standing right outside, waiting for me to answer. But there was no one. I was alone. I slowly walked to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I opened it slowly, cautiously. Nothing. The hallway was empty, just as it had been before. The lights flickered once more, and the air was cold, almost unbearable. But there was no one there. I was alone. I closed the door behind me, my mind reeling. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to leave. Whatever it was, whatever was in this building, it wasn't something I wanted to stick around for. I grabbed my things quickly, heart pounding in my chest. As I rushed toward the elevator, I glanced back toward the hallway. The office door was wide open, and then I heard it. A voice, faint and distant. Leave. I didn't hesitate. I turned on my heel and ran out of the building, not stopping until I reached my car. I didn't look back. I never worked another night shift there. I don't care if they offered me double pay. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that office had been trying to tell me something. I never wanted to know what it was. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The clock on the wall ticked away, the only sound breaking the eerie silence in the office. I glanced at the time, 2:45 a.m. I was in the middle of finishing up an important report and trying to ignore the feeling of isolation creeping in. It was the second week of my night shift, working alone at the small accounting firm. I was the only one there. Everyone else had left hours ago, and the office felt like a ghost town. The dim hum of the fluorescent lights above did little to calm the uneasy tension building in my chest. I'd never been one to get spooked easily. A late-night worker by nature, I always thought I thrived in the quiet of a nearly empty office. It was peaceful, productive, just me, my thoughts, and the occasional email. But tonight was different. The atmosphere felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were closing in. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was the storm outside, the relentless downpour that made the windows rattle, or the fact that the building was older than most, and every creak or groan made the place feel more like a haunted house. The building had been renovated recently, but it still held on to its old charm, or old quirks, depending on how you looked at it. The office itself was situated in a nondescript, old brick building downtown. The floors were wooden, the walls papered with outdated designs, and the windows were large but old, offering little protection against the wind and rain. It was easy to see why some people got spooked by the place, but I wasn't one of them. Still, tonight, there was something that made the air feel different. It felt colder than usual, despite the thermostat being set to a comfortable temperature. Every now and then, I'd hear a faint sound in the distance, like a whisper or a distant shuffle. But when I'd check the hallway, I was always met with an empty space. It wasn't until I was deep into the report that I heard it, a faint scratching sound. At first, I thought it was the wind outside, rattling the windows, but then the scratching grew louder. It wasn't like the usual creaking noises the building made. This was deliberate. It sounded like something or someone dragging their feet down the hallway. My blood ran cold. I looked toward the hallway from my desk. The lights at the far end flickered slightly, casting long shadows. My heart started pounding, but I shook my head. It was probably just a rat or something. Nothing to worry about. I'd heard stories of vermin in old buildings, and it was likely the cause of the strange noise. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I stood up and hesitantly walked toward the source of the sound. My shoes clicked against the wooden floor with each step, amplifying the silence that filled the air. The hallway was empty. There was no sign of anything that could have caused the noise. It was then that I noticed the storage room door was ajar. I had left it closed earlier when I passed through, but now it was slightly open, just enough to make me uncomfortable. The storage room wasn't used much, just a small closet for old paperwork, file cabinets, and supplies, but I'd always made sure it was locked at night. A chill ran down my spine. I walked closer to the door, my mind racing. There was no way anyone could have gotten in without me noticing. The back door was locked, the security system was active, and I hadn't heard anyone enter the building. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky as I stood in the doorway. The silence that followed was deafening. I couldn't explain why, but my instinct told me not to go in. Yet I stepped forward anyway, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. The air inside the room was cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of the office. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw the familiar rows of filing cabinets and boxes. Nothing seemed out of place. The only unusual thing was a small object on the floor near the back corner. It was a piece of paper. I bent down and picked it up, expecting it to be some forgotten document, but as I unfolded it, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a document at all. It was a photo, a black and white photo of the office building, taken from an angle I didn't recognize. The photo was old, the edges frayed, and there, standing in one of the windows, was a figure, a shadowy figure, almost obscured by the foggy glass. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity. I didn't recognize the figure. It didn't belong in the photo, yet it seemed oddly familiar. I felt a sudden sense of dread wash over me, like the air around me had thickened. My fingers trembled as I held the photo, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I turned the photo over, hoping for some kind of explanation, but the back was blank. Before I could process what was happening, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Soft at first, but growing louder, coming closer. I spun around, expecting to see someone walking down the hallway, but there was no one there. I froze. The footsteps continued, this time from the hallway right outside the storage room. They weren't distant now. They were just beyond the door. I heard the faint shuffle of shoes against the floor, and I felt a rush of cold air move past me. My body went rigid with fear, and I slowly turned back to face the room. The door was still wide open. "Hello?" I called again, my voice weak and barely above a whisper. No answer. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, almost like someone was standing just behind me, but when I turned to look, there was no one there, just the empty room. I dropped the photo onto the floor, my mind racing. My hands were clammy as I backed out of the room. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and then everything went quiet. The silence was unbearable. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I quickly turned and ran back to my desk, desperate to leave. But as I reached for my coat and bag, I heard a soft, raspy voice, almost a whisper. "Get out." I froze. The voice wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It was a low, gravelly voice, full of warning and malice. I knew I had to leave. My instincts screamed at me to run. I grabbed my things and bolted out of the office, not daring to look back. I didn't care about the paperwork I had left behind. I didn't care about anything except getting out of that building. I didn't return for the rest of the week. When I finally went back, everything seemed normal. The office was as it always had been, quiet, empty, and unchanged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that whatever was in that building was still there, waiting for the next person to hear it. I never worked the night shift alone again. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I had only been working at the small graphic design firm for about a month when they asked me to cover the night shift. It wasn't a regular thing, just once in a while when someone was sick or needed a break. The office was quiet at night, and I didn't mind the solitude. The hours were long, and the building wasn't exactly modern, but I didn't feel unsafe. After all, I'd worked night shifts at other places before and always managed just fine. The office itself was in a converted warehouse in the middle of an industrial district. The kind of building that looked old but had been renovated to fit the needs of a small business. The walls were brick, the floors polished concrete, and the windows large, letting in plenty of natural light during the day. At night, though, the office became another place entirely. The shadows stretched long, and the old building seemed to groan with every gust of wind. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound that kept me company. On this particular night, I had been working for a few hours and was nearing the end of my shift. It was around 2 a.m., and I was focused on a final design that needed tweaking. The computer screen glowed brightly in the dark room, and the soft clicks of my mouse echoed in the otherwise empty space. I'd just taken a break, grabbing a cup of coffee from the break room, when I heard it. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the hallway. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the sound of the building settling. This was something distinct, something human. I tried to brush it off, assuming it was the wind or maybe a sound from one of the other nearby buildings, but the office was practically in the middle of nowhere. There was no way anyone else should be in here at this hour. I waited for a moment, straining my ears. Nothing. The office was silent again. I told myself I was just imagining things, and maybe I was. It had been a long night. But then, it came again. A soft shuffle, like footsteps, slow and deliberate. This time I couldn't ignore it. I stood up from my desk, my pulse quickening. The building was old, sure, but the hallways were narrow, and it was unlikely there was anyone else there. I checked my phone to make sure no one was coming in, no missed calls or texts, no reason anyone should be here. I crept into the hallway, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The lights overhead flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The hallway was empty. There was no sign of anyone. No one at the far end. No one in the break room. The doors to the other offices were all closed. The building felt colder now, and as I stood there, I had the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I listened to the silence. I told myself it was just nerves, that it was probably nothing. But something didn't sit right. I went back to my desk, but my mind was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there with me. I glanced over at the security cameras. They were set up to monitor the building, but the screens just showed static. All I could see was the blur of the night outside the windows. I didn't know why that made me feel even more uneasy, but it did. Around 3 a.m., I had nearly forgotten about the footsteps. Almost. I was working through a design when I heard a loud bang. It came from the storage closet at the far end of the office, a small room where we kept old supplies and extra materials. The bang echoed in the otherwise quiet space, and my heart jumped in my chest. The door to the storage closet had been closed, but now it was open, just a crack. My hands trembled as I slowly walked toward the closet. The door was still swinging slightly, as if something had just hit it. I couldn't tell if it had been open before, but I was sure I hadn't opened it. I pushed it further open, my breath shallow, unsure of what I might find inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway. Empty. Nothing out of the ordinary. A few boxes stacked up in the corner, a chair, the overhead light humming softly. I backed out of the room, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I didn't want to stay any longer, but I had to finish the work. My shift was nearly over, and the last thing I needed was to leave unfinished tasks behind. But then came another sound, something subtle, just beyond the storage room. It was like someone was lightly tapping on the window. I stood frozen, my mind racing. The window was on the other side of the building, looking out into the parking lot. I hadn't seen anyone outside when I checked earlier, but now I couldn't ignore it. The tapping was faint but clear. It was rhythmic, like someone was standing outside, tapping on the glass. I walked cautiously toward the window, half expecting to see someone standing there, their face pressed up against the glass. But when I pulled the curtain back, I saw nothing but darkness outside. The parking lot was empty, no cars, no movement. The tapping stopped as soon as I looked out the window. I stepped back from the window, the room feeling colder now. My hands were shaking. I glanced at the clock, 4:10 a.m. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. Whatever was going on, it was beyond strange. I grabbed my things and quickly headed for the exit. As I walked past the hallway again, something caught my eye. The door to the storage closet was wide open. I knew for a fact that I had closed it when I left. My mind was racing. I turned back, afraid to look, but I did anyway. It was when I reached the storage room door that the unmistakable sound came again. This time it was clear. Footsteps, right behind me. I spun around in panic, expecting to see someone standing there. But no one was there. The hallway was empty. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, my hands sweating as I backed away toward the exit. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look behind me. But when I reached the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I stepped out of the building as quickly as I could and didn't stop until I was in my car, locking the doors behind me. I didn't return to the office the next day. I didn't return for days after that, and eventually, I asked to be reassigned to day shifts. I couldn't explain what happened that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe it was something else, something I'll never fully understand. But I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of hearing those footsteps that led me deeper into the night, and I'll never forget the cold, cold air that surrounded me when the tapping started. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I was working the night shift alone at a small law firm downtown. The building was old, one of those that had been converted from a warehouse into office space years ago. It was a tall structure with exposed brick, high ceilings, and narrow hallways. The floors creaked with every step, and the elevator had a mind of its own, often getting stuck between floors. But despite the quirks of the place, it was quiet, and I liked that. It was around 1 a.m. when things started to feel off. I had been working on a set of documents, the dim light from my desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The office was on the 3rd floor, and I had been alone for hours. Everyone else had gone home for the night. The building was usually empty by the time I arrived at 10 p.m., but tonight I was feeling unusually aware of every creak and groan of the old structure. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the building settling, but then I heard something more distinct. A soft shuffle, not from outside my office, but from down the hallway. It was faint, barely audible, like someone walking with their shoes dragging against the floor. I leaned back in my chair trying to ignore it, but it was impossible to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. I got up from my desk and walked over to the hallway. There was no one there, no one in the other offices, no movement. The hallway was empty, bathed in the dim light from the overhead fixtures. I stared down the hallway for a moment, convinced I had imagined the sound. But as I turned to head back to my desk, I heard it again, a shuffle, followed by a soft tapping noise, like someone gently knocking on a door. I froze. I couldn't make sense of it. I had been working here for months, and nothing like this had ever happened. The building had its quirks, sure, but nothing that would explain the sound of footsteps when no one else was supposed to be there. I checked my phone. No messages, no calls. Everyone else was long gone, and the building was locked up tight. But the sounds continued, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't until I walked back to my desk that I saw something that made my blood run cold. The office door, which I had left closed behind me, was now slightly ajar. The air in the room felt different, colder somehow, and my skin tingled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My mind raced. I quickly closed the door again and sat down at my desk, hoping the chill would pass. But the more I tried to focus on my work, the more the feeling of unease grew. I tried to push it aside. There were always rational explanations for these things. Maybe the air conditioning had kicked on, making the temperature drop. Maybe the wind had caused a slight draft that made the door creak. But the sounds I kept hearing weren't from the wind. They were too deliberate, too intentional. I could feel my pulse quicken. I needed to get out of the office. I grabbed my jacket and walked over to the door, preparing to leave. That's when I heard it again. The shuffle of footsteps, now louder, like they were getting closer. I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway this time, but from the stairwell that led to the lower floors. The building was only 4 stories tall, and the stairwell was at the far end of the hall, tucked away behind a small door. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and the unmistakable scraping noise followed. It was too deliberate to be the wind. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. I was torn between fleeing the building and investigating what was causing the noise. I couldn't make sense of it. No one else was supposed to be there. I knew I had locked the front door when I arrived, and the security cameras showed no movement outside the building. So where was this sound coming from? I grabbed the flashlight from my desk drawer, my hands trembling as I turned it on. The narrow hallway felt longer than it usually did, stretching out in front of me. The footsteps had stopped, but the unease in the air remained thick and palpable. Slowly, I made my way to the stairwell, my heart racing with each step. The stairwell door was slightly open. I had never seen it like that before. The door was always closed tightly unless someone was using it. But now it was just slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of darkness visible through the crack. The air in the hallway was colder, and I could feel my breath forming in the air. I pushed the door open, shining the flashlight into the dark stairwell. Nothing. Just the still, quiet space leading down to the lower floors. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, like someone calling my name. It was distant, but clear. My name. I froze. I looked down the stairwell, the darkness seeming to stretch infinitely below me. There was no one there, no movement, no sign of anyone. The whispering continued, coming from somewhere deep in the stairwell. It was unmistakable now, clearer than ever. "Come down here," it said. It wasn't my own voice, but something low and distorted, almost like an echo. My pulse was racing now, my whole body trembling. I should have run. I should have turned around and never looked back. But curiosity, or maybe something darker, compelled me to take a step further into the stairwell. I called out. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer, but the whisper continued, persistent, growing louder and more urgent. "Come down here," it said again, the words slithering through the silence. I didn't want to go any further, but it was like something was pulling me, urging me to walk down into the darkness. I stood frozen, the light of the flashlight trembling in my hand. Then suddenly, a door slammed shut at the far end of the hallway. The sharp noise made me jump, and I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. The door to the stairwell was now completely closed. I was no longer alone in the building. I ran. I didn't care about locking up or finishing the work. My mind was consumed with the need to escape. I sprinted down the hallway to the exit, the sound of my shoes pounding against the floor echoing in the silence. I threw open the front door and rushed out into the night, feeling the cool air against my skin as I breathed a shaky sigh of relief. The next morning, I spoke to my coworker, Ben, who had worked there for years. He didn't look surprised when I told him about what had happened. In fact, he seemed almost nonchalant. "Oh yeah," he said. "It happens sometimes. People say the building is haunted. It's been around for a while, you know. Before it was converted into office space, it was a warehouse. Before that, it was an old hospital." I stared at him, my blood running cold. "Didn't you know?" he asked, sensing my shock. "The place has history. People say they've seen things, heard things. I guess it doesn't like being empty at night." I didn't go back for the night shift after that. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The night shift wasn't something I had ever been eager to take on, but it was part of the job. I worked as a receptionist at a small law firm, and when the regular receptionist needed time off, I was asked to cover the graveyard shift. It was quiet, and I could get a lot of reading done, so I agreed. The office was old, with large wooden desks and the smell of aged leather and paper hanging in the air. It was the kind of place that had seen better days, but still had a certain charm to it. The kind of place that felt like it could have secrets to share. though I didn't know just how right I was. The first few nights went by without incident. I'd sit at the front desk, occasionally answering phone calls or dealing with emails, but most of the time it was just me, the sound of the clock ticking, and the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The building was eerily quiet, and aside from the sound of my own movements, the space was dead still. Then, about a week into my shift, things started to change. It was around 2 a.m. when I first heard the sound. At first, I thought it was just the old building settling, the creaks of the wood in the walls and floors, but then it came again. A soft shuffle, like the sound of shoes dragging across the floor. I froze, my eyes darting to the hallway beyond my desk. The noise was faint but distinct, as if someone was walking, but I was certain I was alone. I stood up slowly, peering down the long hallway. Nothing. The hallway was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the emergency lights that flickered faintly in the corners. I walked quietly to the end of the hall, passing empty offices, all of them dark and lifeless. I checked the back door. It was locked. No one could have entered the building without setting off the alarm. I stood there for a moment, listening. The shuffle had stopped. The building was quiet again, almost too quiet. Maybe I was just overreacting, I told myself. After all, old buildings make strange noises, don't they? I returned to my desk, trying to shake off the feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to focus on the pile of paperwork in front of me, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, its steady beat almost deafening in the silence. I tried to concentrate, but all I could hear was the faint hum of the lights above me and the occasional rustle of paper. That's when I heard it again. This time it wasn't a shuffle. It was a soft knock coming from one of the nearby offices. I jumped, my heart racing. The sound was so clear, so deliberate. Someone was knocking, slowly, methodically, on one of the office doors. I stared down the hallway, my breath caught in my throat. No one else was here. It was just me. I stood slowly this time, as if moving too quickly might cause whatever it was to disappear. I checked each of the offices, one by one. Empty. Not a soul in sight. The knocking had stopped. I didn't know what to think. I was alone, or so I thought. The office next to mine had a frosted window, and as I passed by, something caught my eye. A shadow moved across the glass, just a flicker. I froze again, heart in my throat. I pressed my face against the glass, but I saw nothing. It was just a shadow, nothing more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't want to be here anymore. The longer I stayed, the more I felt like I was being pulled deeper into something I couldn't understand. I had to leave. I grabbed my purse, moving quickly to the front door, eager to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard it again, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a trick of my imagination, but the whisper grew louder, clearer. It was coming from the hallway just behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. The whisper wasn't coming from anyone. It was coming from nowhere. I could feel my chest tighten as the whisper grew more distinct. It wasn't just a voice. It was a message. Stay. The words sent a chill through my entire body. My fingers froze on the door handle. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that I had heard the whisper or that I didn't want to leave. The sense of dread that had been hanging over me was now replaced with an odd compulsion. It felt like something was pulling me back, urging me to stay. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place. But the whisper continued, persistent and growing stronger, echoing in my mind. Stay. I slowly released the door handle and took a step back into the office, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. My heart was pounding now. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew I had to find out. The hallway was even quieter now, the silence pressing in on me like a weight. I glanced down to the far end of the hall, where the light was dimming. The shadow I had seen earlier seemed to shift again, this time moving across the wall at the far end. It was unmistakable. Something was there. I stepped forward cautiously, each movement slow and deliberate, my heart pounding louder in my ears with every step. The door to the conference room at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, and I could see the shadow moving just beyond the frame. I reached out and pushed the door open with a trembling hand. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small desk lamp near the far wall. The shadow I had seen was gone, but something felt off. The air in the room was heavier, colder, like the temperature had dropped several degrees. I felt my stomach churn as I stepped further into the room. There was something there. A presence. A weight I couldn't explain. I turned back to the door. That's when I saw it. On the floor near the center of the room was a single sheet of paper. It was old, yellowed, and creased as if it had been there for years. I bent down to pick it up, my hand trembling. The handwriting was messy, rushed, as though written in a panic. "Don't stay." The words seemed to burn into my mind as I stared at them. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what any of this meant. But at that moment, the room felt like it was closing in on me. I had to leave. I grabbed my bag and bolted toward the exit, but as I reached for the door handle, I felt something brush against the back of my neck, cold and clammy, like fingers grazing my skin. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. I didn't stop running until I reached the parking lot, the door slamming shut behind me as I pushed through. I could still feel the cold lingering on my skin. I never went back to that office again. A few months later, I learned from a former coworker that there had been reports of strange happenings in the building long before I started working there. Some said the place was haunted by the spirit of an old employee who had mysteriously disappeared years ago. Others claimed it was the restless souls of people who had once worked there and had never quite left. But whatever the explanation, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ever going back. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The office was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the vending machine and the occasional creak of the old building settling. It was nearly 2 a.m., and I was the only one left, wrapping up some reports for a tight deadline. I had pulled night shifts before, but something about this one felt off. Maybe it was the storm outside, the heavy rain pounding against the windows, or maybe it was the way the fluorescent lights flickered every now and then, as if the power wasn't stable. I worked for a small security monitoring company, handling overnight surveillance for various businesses. The office itself was on the 5th floor of an aging building that had once been a factory, converted into office spaces decades ago. Most tenants had regular hours, meaning I was often the only one in the entire building past midnight. At first, I told myself the silence was peaceful. No distractions, no coworkers chatting, just me, the computer screens, and the occasional beep from the security feeds. But then, just past 2:15 a.m., something happened. The motion sensor alert chimed. I glanced at the screen, expecting to see a stray cat or maybe a flicker from the storm, triggering a false alarm. But no. Camera 3, storage room, level 2. The black and white feed showed the dimly lit storage hallway of a company that rented space downstairs. A row of locked doors lined one side, and an old vending machine stood against the other. I stared at the screen, waiting for movement. There! A shadow! A tall, thin figure moved just out of the camera's range. My breath caught. No one should be there. That floor was closed at night. I grabbed the office phone and dialed the building's night security guard, Frank. It rang twice before he picked up. "Yeah?" His voice was gruff, groggy. "Frank, I just saw something on camera 3, level 2, storage hallway. Can you check it out?" A pause. Then, "You sure? Ain't nobody in the building except you and me." I glanced back at the screen. The hallway was empty now, but I knew I had seen something. "Just take a look?" I asked. Frank sighed. "Fine, give me a sec." I watched the feed, waiting for him to appear. A minute passed, 2. Then his flashlight beam cut through the hallway as he walked into frame. He looked around, checked the doors. Nothing. He raised the radio to his mouth. "No one here, kid. Must have been a glitch." I exhaled, half relieved, half unsettled. "All right. Thanks, Frank." He gave the camera a half-hearted salute before walking off. The hallway emptied again. I tried to focus on my work, but something gnawed at me. I replayed the footage, slowing it down, squinting at the shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. It moved with purpose. By 3 a.m., I had nearly convinced myself it was nothing, until the office lights flickered. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. The air in the room suddenly felt colder. A slow, creeping dread crawled up my spine. Then, somewhere in the office, a chair scraped against the floor. My breath hitched. I wasn't alone. I turned my head toward the cubicles. The glow of my monitors barely reached past my own desk, leaving the rest of the office in deep shadow. I swallowed hard and called out, "Frank?" Silence. I reached for my phone to call him again. Just as I unlocked the screen, I saw movement in my reflection on the darkened window, a figure standing between the desks. I spun around. Nothing. The space was empty. I forced a shaky laugh. Lack of sleep. Stress. My mind was playing tricks, and then the motion sensor chimed again. I turned back to the monitor. Camera 3. Storage room. Level 2. My stomach twisted. I clicked the feed. This time, I saw it clearly. A woman, standing dead center in the hallway, staring directly into the camera. Long dark hair hung limp around her pale face. She wore what looked like a hospital gown, torn and dirty. Her arms dangled at her sides, fingers twitching. I blinked. She was closer now. No movement. No transition. Just closer. A lump formed in my throat. The feed flickered. Now she was right in front of the camera. Her mouth opened, but there was no sound. The screen glitched again, static for half a second, and when it cleared, she was gone. I shoved back from my desk, my chair rolling away with a loud screech. I needed to leave. Grabbing my bag, I rushed toward the door, but before I reached it, the office phone rang. The shrill noise made me jump. I hesitated. No one should be calling at this hour. The caller ID simply read, "Line 2, storage room." My hands were shaking. I reached for the phone, pressed it to my ear. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, breathing. Slow, ragged, too close. I slammed the phone down and bolted for the stairs, deciding the elevator was too risky. As I reached the stairwell door, my phone buzzed. A text from Frank. "Leaving early, power outage in garage. Be careful." I swore under my breath. He had already left. I yanked open the stairwell door and started down, moving as quickly as I could without tripping. My footsteps echoed in the empty shaft. 3rd floor. 2nd. Something moved above me. I froze. Soft footsteps. Descending. A slow, deliberate pace. I turned my head, looking up the stairwell. It was dim, but I saw movement on the landing above me. A figure. Her. My breath hitched. My legs screamed at me to move, but fear held me in place. Then she lurched forward. I didn't think. I ran. I hit the 1st floor door hard, slamming into the lobby. The glass front doors were locked, but I fumbled for my keycard, swiping it with shaking hands. The lock clicked, and I pushed through, stumbling into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I yanked the door open, jumped inside, and locked it. My chest was heaving, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I glanced back at the building. The stairwell window was dark, empty. But as I put the car in drive, my phone buzzed one last time. A notification from the security app. Motion detected. Storage room. Level 2. I didn't look, I just drove. The next day, I quit the night shift. I never found out who or what she was, but sometimes late at night when I close my eyes, I still see her, standing there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting eerie shadows on the gray walls of the empty office. Daniel adjusted his chair and sighed, glancing at the clock. 2:13 a.m., another long, mind-numbing night shift. He was the only one in the building, tasked with monitoring security feeds and finishing up reports that no one else wanted to do. The office was located on the 5th floor of an old commercial building, one that had seen better days. The floors creaked, the ventilation system hummed loudly, and at night the entire place felt lifeless, except for the occasional unsettling noises that seemed to come from nowhere. Daniel shook his head. He had been working this shift for months, and he was used to the isolation. He put on his headphones, drowning out the silence with soft music, and focused on his computer screen. Then it happened. A faint tapping sound echoed from down the hallway. His fingers froze over the keyboard, and he pulled off his headphones. The tapping continued, steady, deliberate, almost like footsteps. His heart thumped. He turned his chair towards the dark hallway that led to the break room. The overhead lights flickered again, and for a split second, he thought he saw a shadow move past the open doorway. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. No response. Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Just my mind playing tricks on me. He turned back to his screen, trying to ignore the growing unease twisting in his stomach. The security feeds were all normal. Empty hallways, closed doors, nothing unusual. Then, a movement on one of the cameras caught his attention. The live feed from the break room showed the door slightly ajar. He was sure it had been shut earlier. He stared at the screen, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then, the door creaked open wider. His breath caught in his throat. There was no one there. A chill crawled up his spine. He reached for his phone and debated calling security, but he knew how that would go. They'd brush it off, tell him it was the old building settling. Trying to shake off the fear, he stood up and walked toward the break room, his footsteps hesitant. The hallway felt unnaturally cold. He reached the door and slowly pushed it open, peering inside. Nothing. Just the usual. The vending machine, the coffee maker, the table with a few scattered papers. He let out a shaky breath and turned to leave. Then he saw it. The reflection in the vending machine's glass. A figure stood directly behind him. Daniel spun around, but the hallway was empty. His heart pounded against his ribs. He backed away, barely able to breathe. He could still see the reflection, though, a tall, shadowy figure with hollow eyes watching him. Then the vending machine lights flickered, and the reflection disappeared. Daniel bolted back to his desk, his hands trembling. He checked the security feed again. Nothing had changed, no sign of movement. But his gut told him otherwise. Then something new appeared on the screen. One by one, the hallway cameras began to cut out, replaced by static. The darkness on the monitor felt suffocating, as if something was crawling through the unseen void. Then, the last camera feed, his own office, went black. The lights overhead flickered violently, and then everything went dark. Daniel froze in his chair, unable to see a thing. The silence pressed down on him. Then the whisper came, a rasping breath right behind his ear. "You're not alone." Daniel screamed. The lights flickered back on and the monitors powered up again. Everything was as it had been, normal, empty, except for the single bloody handprint on his desk. Daniel didn't wait to investigate. He grabbed his belongings and ran, abandoning his shift, vowing never to return. The next morning, the day staff found his workstation untouched, his chair still slightly pulled out. The security footage showed nothing. No flickering lights, no mysterious figure. But on the wall near his desk, in faint, smeared writing, was a message: "See you next shift." Story, the end.